Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today and for inviting me to speak with you. I'm honoured to share some thoughts and track the journey of a fantastic new replica Roman distance sculpture that's now in position at Lambhill Stables. And this is one of the outcomes from the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, which is establishing and installing 5 new replica distance sculptures from the Antonine Wall here in Scotland. But first, I thought it may be quite useful to provide some geographical, chronological, and some cultural context into which these unique monuments sit. Now, as the name suggests, these are a collection of sculptures that have been recovered from along the Antonine Wall, and that is the Roman Empire's most northwesterly frontier. Now, this was a massive monument that cleaved a route through the central belt of Scotland, right across the Clyde Forth Isthmus. Now, along the wall there were 17 forts constructed, as we can see here, and interspersed between those forts were a series of smaller fortlets and watchtowers. So, to put the wall into its wider geographical and its strategic importance, it's highlighted here at the top left of your screen is one segment of part of a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site entitled Frontiers of the Roman Empire, which stretches across several countries. Now, the region that we currently know as Scotland saw several incursions from the Roman army, dating all the way from the 1st through to the 4th century CE. Now, the period that we, of course, are particularly interested in is the sort of early to middle 2nd century, when the Emperor Antoninus Pius commissioned the construction of this mural barrier around 142. And to give you an idea of how the forts I mentioned a moment ago along the wall looked, this is Rough Castle. It's in fact in Falkirk, and it's pretty much the best preserved fort along the wall. We can see the outline of the fort here, and then there's some annex buildings or some annexes over to the side here. So it's a kind of complex, if you like, of different features sitting along the wall that we can just about make out on the top there. This aerial shot hopefully provides a wider geographical perspective and setting of Rough Castle Fort, which is just down on the left now here, in its setting with the remains of the Antonine Wall. So what we have effectively is, on the south we have the Roman controlled area, and to the north we have as the Romans would have called them, wild barbarian northerners who had been potentially quite hostile to that incoming Roman military force. And then down the centre we have the Antonine Wall remains. And we'll go over that in a bit more detail in a moment. But after a long period when knowledge of the wall had actually fallen completely out of memory, its antiquarian rediscovery prompted the General William Roy to record its surviving features and remains of forts in great detail in his military map of Scotland dating to 1793. And so what this does is it gives us a really fantastic overview of plans of all the surviving fort remains along the wall, and you can see that all of them are actually quite different in character, but they do survive well up until that point, and it's a very useful historic document and resource and record really of these standing remains in the late 18th century. On the bottom we even have some really interesting profiles of the wall. That is a sideways view, if you like, of the terrain into which the forts sat. But there's long been interest in the Antonine Wall since the antiquarian times, and in fact the Glasgow Archaeological Society in particular was very prolific in undertaking investigations and excavations along it, and helping it really to augment our understanding of the wall and the features along it. as well as the installations along it. So maintaining that Rough Castle Fort connection we had a moment ago, here we have members of the Glasgow Historical Society at Rough Castle Fort dating to the 19th century. And the astute amongst you might notice that actually on the left here we have a woman, which is quite an unusual event of the day to see women involved in these activities. And we also have a couple of children in this photograph as well, which is great to see some young people, even in those days, being interested in their heritage. So the Antonine wall differs very markedly from its predecessor and neighbour to the south that doubtless many of you are very familiar with, Hadrian's Wall. And unlike Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine wall was not constructed of stone, but in fact it was constructed of large turf slabs that were laid atop of each other, and that stretched to somewhere between 3 to 4 metres high, and that's roughly a minimum of 20 turfs deep. And we can just see that in profile here in this section of the wall that's been cut through, and all of these kind of squared off rectangular features that we see, it gives us a really clear and interesting understanding of the stratigraphy of the layers upon which all of these turfs sat and constructed the wall. But actually we speak a lot about the wall. In fact, the wall was only one feature of an infrastructure of connected elements. And these elements include the turf rampart, which we see here in remain, which is the wall itself. And as I mentioned, that stood to a height of between 3 and 4 metres, and that was inclusive of a stone base. We'll talk a bit about that a little bit more in a moment. So immediately to the north of that we have the berm, which is a platform that separated the wall from the deep ditch. It was a deep 5 metre V-cut ditch, which is often referred to as an ankle breaker. And we can see why that is potentially the nomenclature for this very Roman characteristic ditch, which is a very, very sharp incline with a ending in a very sharp V at the bottom. As I say, very characteristic of Roman ditches. Immediately to the north of that ditch you'll see the upcast mound, and that was constructed of the spoil from the ditch. But one feature that is very rarely discussed but should really be considered an equally essential part of that infrastructure is the military way. And that sits on the south of the wall or in the Roman controlled part of the frontier. A little bit more of that later. But taken together, all of these features really created a sequence of defensive elements against which any incursions from these northern barbarians, as Roman writers would have termed these local hostile people. So I guess we could say it's a bit like a modern day Ironman obstacle course, if you like, that some people actually now do for fun. Not me, but I know colleagues who actually spend their weekends doing this. And I just wanted to show you how this type of activity really demonstrates what it might have been like trying to navigate and get over that really muddy feature of a wall back in the day, which would not have been a pleasant experience, and you would have had a lot of obstacles to overcome to get to that point. And here, just to give you maybe a better understanding of the construction phases of the wall, we can see the illustration here of the ditch being cut. The legions are discussing the best way to undertake their activities. Just to the north of that, at the berm, we can see these oblong shaped holes in the ground there, lilia, which are effectively another set of obstacles. They would have had these really sharp sharpened wooden sticks pointing out of them, probably covered by bracken or other such bush type material to hide them, and they would have had, as I say, spikes embedded into them to create a very dangerous obstacle for any hostile northerners to try to navigate as they reach the wall, which itself may have had similar types of stakes protruding from it. On the top we potentially have a walkway, certainly where the forts were located, with some bastion up there, and on the right we can see a reconstruction of a gateway that would have been placed where the openings along the wall would have allowed the movement of people back and forth from the north into the south again. And just to give you even a better idea of how that wall base was constructed, here are the foundations at Bearsden Fort, New Kilpatrick, and as I say, they give us a really interesting understanding and context for that very wide, 4 metre wide stone base that was required for that heavy turf wall to sit atop. We can even see that central ditch, a drainage ditch running through that there. And again, that drainage ditch coming up on the bottom of the screen, just to give you that overview of the structure that would have been at the base to hold the very heavy rampart on top. So getting back to our main topic of discussion today, the distant sculptures. Here is a map of their find spots in the vicinity of the wall. You'll see that many of them have been recovered from the western sector of the wall, and we'll discuss where the distant sculpture we're talking about today comes from in just a moment. So I thought it'd be very useful to give you an idea of some of the distant sculptures that we have, and this is the Bridge Nest sculpture. It's perhaps the best known example of distant sculptures. It's now located in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, and it's a really beautifully preserved example of these unique monuments. And what it does is, I think it demonstrates really nicely a familiar format that we have for them. Here we have a central inscription panel. Is flanked on either side by some really beautifully articulated iconography. Sometimes we also have these pelta on the side, which are shield-like shapes that frame on either side these types of central inscription panels, which are, as we see here, quite often framed with double-ribbed or single-ribbed frames. But actually, I wanted to draw your attention to the inscriptions themselves. Even those of you who are potentially familiar with Latin may not necessarily immediately recognise the text here as Latin, and that's because what we have is a very formulaic, abbreviated format of Latin that is very common to Roman inscriptions of the day. And from the Bridge Nest sculpture we can see the pattern of the abbreviated words that are common to all of our distant sculptures, along with the English translation. So just to very briefly state, the Latin abbreviated is Impses Tito Elio Hedre Antonino Og Pio PP Lig to Og Per, and then MP, lots of Roman numerals, and Fec. And that translates to for the Emperor Caesar Titus Aelius Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius, to give the Emperor his full title. Father of his country, the Second Augustan Legion built this over a distance of 4,652 units of measure. So these sculptures actually served several purposes. They are dedications to the emperor, showing legionary loyalty primarily, but they also document the legions who were here building the frontier, and that is, as we know, the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th, and we know this because we have these inscriptions. They also tell us, with that number at the bottom, which differs on different distant sculptures. So they tell us the length of the frontier that each of these legions were building, hence their nomenclature. But they also, in fact, provide some really graphic scenes of life on the frontier. So we have things like on the right, we can see a religious scene. Natural fact, what we're seeing is the legions undertaking a sacrificial ceremony. We also have other examples of deities, Roman deities, and also some military activities. So on the left, for example, we see quite a familiar scene from Roman frontier sculptures, which is a scene of battle. Here we have a Roman cavalryman who is riding down and in fact decapitating naked northern warriors in the heat of a very vicious battle. Now, another example of this type of sculpture, another distance sculpture, is the Summerston farm piece on the bottom right here. But actually, we have a similar format, and in fact, you'll notice that on the left of the Summerston farm, rather than that mid-battle scene on the bridge ness above, we have here now a post-battle scene where we have the northern warriors are now no longer in the heat of battle. They are now captives. We can see their arms are bound behind them. They're still naked. Their swords are scattered on the floor around them. Their shields are scattered around them. And the cavalryman is effectively guarding them whilst receiving honours from the goddess Victory, probably because of the celebration of his victory over these local warriors. But actually also these distance sculptures served as a form of propaganda insofar as they're demonstrating very visibly and visually the might and power and strength of Rome. And that's to various audiences, including Roman soldiers, communities who were followers of the Romans, in local vicus, what we call sort of small villages attached to some of the forts, but also to strike fear into local peoples who would have also engaged with them. So these are really very powerful and iconic objects that are actually unique across all of the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Now, it might surprise you to know that none of these objects were found in their original contexts on the wall. Many, in fact, were found in the immediate vicinity south of the Muro barrier, but others, in fact, were built into boundary walls or gateways of nearby stately homes. One even made its way all the way north to Kincardineshire, where it was embedded into the Great Hall of Dunnottar Castle by the Earls Marshal, and that is a really enigmatic setting just off the northeast coast of Scotland. But that's a whole other story, and we don't have time to cover it today. But conventional wisdom has always been adamant that the distance sculptures record the measurements of the wall, that is, the rampart's construction. But you'll remember I mentioned earlier that the infrastructure of the wall included the military way. Now, the military way is a critical feature of the frontier because it was used to transport troops and supplies along, and I'm quite sure local people may also have used this roadway to navigate the area as well. Why wouldn't they? But I'm also going to suggest, quite controversially, I would say that since only in fact two of the distance sculpture make very explicit mention of the wall's construction, in fact I'm going to suggest the distance sculpture might more logically have been placed along the military way. A bit like road markers that we're very accustomed to seeing today, in fact. And I think if I can show you this next image, I stole this from a presentation made by Dutch scholars on a completely different topic recently, but I think it really demonstrates my point very nicely. If we can imagine these Roman soldiers walking along the military way near that border, they are going to encounter, I would suspect, these distance sculptures telling them that the next section of the road that they're walking along was constructed by the 2nd or the 6th or the 20th Legion. So a bit of competition going on there to show you and to show them really what, how much of the frontier each of these legions were building. And in fact, some of the distant sculptures were found very closely together, and they had the same distance engraved upon them. But actually, I'm going to suggest that what that might suggest to us is that they were placed back to back, in the same way that if we are crossing maybe the English and Scottish border just now, we will see, or even into a city, you'll see you are just entering Scotland, or you are just entering Glasgow, or you are just leaving. So you, depending on your direction of travel, you would know which section of the wall that you are walking on, and the military way you're walking on was constructed by which legion. So, having gone over all that background, we can now, I think, return to the replica distant sculpture from Summerston Farm and the topic of our discussion today. Now, the Antonine wall runs through 5 local council areas, and part of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project was to replicate distant sculptures from all of these areas. And the intention is to install them into locations close to their original place of discovery. And I'm pleased to say they are now all installed and in place. Now, this sculpture in fact replicates one thought to have been recovered near Lambhill Fort, and it is number 6 on our map, as shown by the arrow. Now, we've seen this earlier in the presentation. It is one of the earliest, this is one of the earliest illustrations of the sculpture, dating from 1694. And here we see this illustration cites the name of Mr. John Graham of Douglaston, who donated this particular sculpture to the Hunterian Museum in 1694. Regrettably, its provenance is quite uncertain because its exact find spot and its context of discovery are unrecorded. Now, some scholars have suggested it came from Castle Hill, and others from Summerston Farm, close to the village of Summerston near Kirkintilloch. But in that familiar abbreviated Latin text, the inscription translates as, "For the Emperor Caesar Titus Aelius Hadrianus Antoninus Augustus Pius," again to give the emperor his full title, "father of his country, the 2nd Augustan Legion built this over a distance of 3,666.5 units of measure." Now, that's a very, very specific measurement that we'll come back to in a moment. This sculpture loosely parallels the Brezhnev sculpture that we saw earlier in composition, although, as I mentioned earlier, on the left we have the panel showing the winged Victory holding a laurel wreath over the head of the cavalryman, or about to be held over the head, more accurately, of the cavalryman who's now guarding those 2 bound, naked, captive northern warriors after the battle. But we never really discussed earlier what's on the right here. And on the right, what we're seeing is Rome's traditional eagle, the symbol of Rome. It is perching atop the back of the 2nd Legion's emblem, a Capricorn. And they are stretched above another naked and bound captive who is now sitting on the floor beside them, or under them, with his shield lying nearby. Now, this is an interesting sculpture as well, because I have been using scientific analysis on this particular sculpture and have been able to confirm that it was painted originally in really vibrant colours, including various shades of red, depicting blood and yellows as well as white across the piece. One interesting feature is that actually red was showing up on the beak of the eagle, which I like to think of as a symbolic representation of the empire feeding off the blood of her enemies. I mentioned that very specific measurement of 3,666.5, and actually that measurement is replicated on 3 additional distant sculptures recovered quite close to this one. One is from Codder House, that's on the right, One's from East Milliken near Bamwildy Fort and from Castle Hill near Bearsden. Interestingly, the Codder House example, like the Summerston Farm one, is dedicated by the 2nd Legion, but these other two have in fact been dedicated by the 6th Legion. Does this validate my suggestion earlier that they actually might face, each one of them might have backed onto each other, facing opposite sides of a roadway, advising travellers which of the legions has constructed the two different sections of the road, or the frontier anyway, that you're travelling upon in either direction. So a really interesting group of connected yet quite different in format and in content and in dedicators set of distance sculptures here. So I think it's really useful to try and track the approach that was taken to articulating and bringing to life our wonderful distance sculpture. Stage one of this was to commission the sculptors, and on this occasion Scottish Borders sculptors Josephine Crossland and Luke Batchelor were commissioned to produce the new Summerston Farm replica. Here we are at the museum, the Hunterian Museum, where most of these distance stones are actually held. Now they're embedded into a centrepiece exhibition at the Hunterian, which I would encourage all of you to go and see if you haven't already. It's a fantastic display. But we're really just discussing all these sculptures and their cultural context, really. But that was stage one in the process. So the next stage was to identify and acquire stone in order to undertake the carving. It's carved from Witton Fell Quarry in North Yorkshire. This is a fine medium grain blown sandstone. It's widely used across the country because of its responsiveness, its durability and its excellent carving quality, which allows for a very sharp iris in sculpture. It's actually also a very similar stone in character to the original sandstone from the Roman distance sculptures. That was much more locally sourced, possibly even from a quarry in Bishopbriggs that was actually used until the 19th century. So the stone, as I say, is used extensively across Scotland. It's an excellent raw material for carving because of that fine grain. It's got really quite unique colouring that provide that really nice sharp crisp edge, and it weathers very well and articulates the letters and iconography quite beautifully. So this permitted the very next stage of the process, which was to actually draw out all of these features, all the iconography and letters for inclusion in the sculpture, so that they were to scale and accurately placed upon the piece. So the original inscriptions were actually quite poorly spaced in some instances and often cramped at line ends, and that's a situation that our modern artists had to emulate by employing typical Roman techniques. They also used hand tools for the sculpture, which, although inevitably slower than, for example, modern drilling techniques and digital laser sculpting, actually permitted really good hand and eye coordination and permitted them to discover the forms in a much more organic and natural way, and that in turn produced an effect much more aligned to the original pieces. So for the next stage, actually, attempts not to overwork the piece actually left some crude tool marks, and that proved quite challenging for the artist because modern day aesthetics in their line of work tends to require a much more precise and refined finish. So it really kind of flies against the natural instincts of highly skilled artisans, asking them to not refine their surfaces too much in order to emulate these old Roman techniques. But they also employed hand carving tools that really have remained largely unchanged from those used by Roman artisans 2000 years ago. And here is the finished product. It's absolutely wonderful, I'm sure you'll agree. It's beautifully crafted, and it's a product that's proudly displayed by the artist here and their apprentice. We don't know his name, I should have asked. but it really is a fabulous piece, ready to be set now into its new context. And here is the sculpture in its new setting at Lambhill Stables. It's now embedded into the rear of another recently completed sculpture, this time of a Roman soldier. His name is Aurelius, and that's another outcome from the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project. It's a spectacular piece, I think you'll agree. It's really an artwork in its own right, and it's sitting in a wonderful, relaxing and very accessible setting. And there's also some lovely seating around the sculpture that permits visitors to sit down and contemplate both of these fantastic sculptures and the landscape that they're now set within. And just to sort of give you an overview of how the sculpture of Aurelius is sitting in that landscape, I think we can see there it's really a fantastic piece from all directions. But critically, this sculpture, with similar traits as all the others that are part of this Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, is not burdened by the restrictions that are necessarily in place in a museum setting. And I say that regarding aspects such as lighting, access times, no touching policies, guided content and interpretations, internet access even to engage with associated digital content. And even things like lighting over the course of the day or during different seasons of the year will transform the way that the sculpture looks and the way that we experience it. Even the stone's patina will alter over time, so that adds a different dimension to the piece. And so people are encouraged to have a really tactile, emotional and fully immersive experience with their new sculptures and forge new relationships, making new places with the sculptures. And really, I'm hoping in the future that I might even meet some of you as you engage with it and the other replicas along the wall. Maybe even help me undertake some of my future research on their contemporary performance, how people are engaging with them and in the present day, really, what kind of stories they're telling about them, etc. So next time you are wandering around your stately home or any stately home, an old church, an old farm building, any old building or even an old boundary wall, look carefully at it, check there isn't a Roman distance sculpture embedded into it, and if there is, make sure you give me a call so that I can come along and see it and assess it. But on a more serious note, the last thing I really wanted to ask you to consider when you're contemplating these objects is imagine how they might have looked in full colour. So I think we're so accustomed to seeing these sculptures, classical sculptures, in, if you like, black and white, but really in plain marble, or in this case plain sandstone. It doesn't really give us an understanding of how they would have looked in the past. My own work has determined that in fact these wonderful sculptures were painted in vibrant polychromy, which is the term we used for painted sculpture. So we're seeing lots of different shades, for example, of red showing up here. We have a different colour of red on the cloak of the cavalryman, on his tunic it's a different colour of red, as is his terges, which is a leather strap piece that sits atop of the tunic. There's even some different red, a different vibrant red for blood on the end of his spear, presumably having been pierced into the side of one of these poor northern warriors. And some really graphic scenes here of blood from the decapitated neck and head of this barbarian, as the Romans would have perceived him, down on the bottom. So I think really bringing to life this graphic and brutal scene of battle, it really, I think, gives it an entirely different dimension. And I think if we can imagine this entire sculpture in the same way with different colours, bringing the people to life, we can start to imagine the impact that these types of sculptures would have had on their original audience, and hopefully on us as a contemporary audience as well. So next time you're in a museum as well, think again about those plain stone classical statues that you're looking at and how they would have looked if they had had their colours applied. So I hope you feel encouraged to travel to Lambhill Stables and experience the sculpture firsthand. You can do so by following the directions in this really helpful map and leaflet that has been produced by the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project team, which offers you information on the sculpture as well as a map on its location, and also a really helpful travel guide on how you can reach the site through various modes of transportation. Again, thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our talk, and I'm very happy to take any questions or comments or discussion points that you want to raise. Thanks again.